Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's online event featuring a very great speaker who will discuss immigration, ethics, and the common good. Before we begin today's event, we would like to begin with an acknowledgement that N4 is hosted at CHIO, which is located in Ottawa, Ontario. Ottawa is built on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. The peoples of the Algonquin Anishinaabe territory have lived on this territory for millennia, and we honor them and this land. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. We also honor all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples for their valuable past and present contributions to this land. My name is Mariah Maddock. I use the pronouns she and her, and I'm a project coordinator with N4. I will be hosting and moderating today's webinar presentation. And my co-host is Colleen Drake, who will be monitoring the question, answer, and chat box today. And I'm very pleased today to introduce you to today's presenter, Dr. Rajesh Shukla. And I'll just invite Dr. Shukla to turn on his video and to give a wave as I introduce him. Dr. Rajesh C. Shukla is an associate professor at the School of Ethics, Social Justice, and Public Service, Faculty of Philosophy at St. Paul University, Ottawa, Canada. His research interests reside at the intersections of moral and political philosophy, focusing particularly on the conceptions of friendship and justice, migration and immigration, ethics and public policy, secularism and democratic citizenship. Rajesh's current research projects is devoted to understanding the impact of migration and immigration on the functioning of democratic societies and welfare states, including Canada. Dr. Shukla was born and raised in India, came to Canada to do his PhD in philosophy, and decided to live here ever since. He is happily settled in Ottawa. And thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Shukla. We're very much looking forward to your presentation. Today's session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our N4 platform as soon as it becomes available. Should there be any technical issues during the webinar, we will inform you with details for an alternate makeup session. And just before we begin, I do want to take a moment to introduce you to our platform features to help to enhance your participation experience. Throughout today's session, we invite you to write your questions using the question and answer window. And if you have the same question as someone else or are interested in a particular response, you do have the option of upvoting a question. Please feel free to upvote questions you're interested in hearing the answers to, and we will prioritize which question we pose to Dr. Shukla first. And our speaker today has no conflicts of interest to declare. And with that said, let's jump right into today's webinar. I will pass it over to you, Dr. Shukla. Thank you, and take it away.
Thank you, Maria, for a very kind introduction. I'm very pleased to give this webinar, and I'm grateful to N4 Group for organizing this webinar and giving me an opportunity to share my thoughts on this important topic as well. So the topic for today is immigration ethics and the common good. And I'm going to request Maria to help me with moving the slides here, and so that we continue to move in a timely way. Well, Canada is often called a nation of immigrants, and rightly so, because when we look at the facts, then Canada turns out to be one of the most welcoming countries in the world. By and large, there is an agreement among various political parties, citizens, people of different stripes regarding immigration. In other words, the role of immigration in Canadian society is widely viewed positively by different stakeholders. When we look at the facts, more than 430,000 immigrants were admitted to Canada in the year that had just passed. The goal is to increase this number next year and the year after. As a result, we see that the immigration intake of Canada is increasing on a regular basis. And Canadian demography reflects it. So for instance, the census 2016 shows that more than 21.9% participants identified themselves as foreign born. This number increased in 2021 census to 22.3%. It is expected that the number will further rise closer to even 30% by 2036. So the value of immigration to Canadian society cannot be overstated. Next slide, please. My goal in this webinar is fourfold. I am not going to argue, for instance, that Canada is one of the best countries in the world when it comes to immigration intake, but to look at certain factors that are relevant to Canadian society and Canadian policy making going forward. To that effect, I shall focus on 4 questions. The first is, what kind of good immigration is in the Canadian context? Second one focuses more on the Canadian consensus on immigration. There has been a consensus on immigration. As I said before, different stakeholders agree on the positive value of immigration in the Canadian society. And my goal would be to ask what can be done to strengthen this consensus and mitigate the half-hearted challenges to immigration that we see every once in a while. The third question that I ask is, what are the obligations of different stakeholders, different participants. And that includes particularly the immigrants as well as the locals in this context. Finally, I should ask what can be done to enhance equity and inclusion in immigration. What can be done, particularly in the Canadian society, to increase the participation of immigrants in various institutions and in various sectors of life? So that would be the final question that I am going to take up today. And it is important to address this because it is going to give a boost to our understanding of the common good in the Canadian context, as I'm going to articulate it today. Next slide, please. So immigration as the common good in the Canadian context connotes, in my mind at least, to two things or two aspects. You can consider immigration as a material good in the sense that immigrants provide skilled labor and other kinds of labor, non-skilled labor. And Canadian society, Canadian state needs people with various capacities, various levels of competence to fill up the jobs that are available. If we look from economic point of view, then we are looking at immigration in the sense of a material good. And that is totally fine. But if we look at immigration from a normative point of view, and I think we should, because as ancient philosophers have taught us, normative goods tend to carry more weight in our lives than material goods. Then immigration in the Canadian context also tends to have a normative value. Now, if you want to understand the distinction between normative goods and material goods, then I think the most plausible way to look at this distinction would be to say that normative goods are intangible, whereas material goods are tangible. And it is also possible that sometimes material goods can be construed as normative goods as well. So in that sense, there is an overlap. And it applies very well in the context of immigration. You can apply this distinction in other spheres of life as well, but in the context of immigration, this is extremely relevant. Immigration in the Canadian society is viewed as a normative good in the sense that we are a nation of immigrants. We take pride in being a nation of immigrants. Our self-image as a country is built on the diversity of people, ideas, and cultures. And in that sense, Canada as a country, Canada as a nation, is a collection of different people, different ethnicity, And what binds them together is their common commitment to shared Canadian aspirations and values. Next slide, please. So look at the functioning of Canadian state and government in the past some years. If you really want to comprehend the full scope of the ideas that are associated with Canada being a nation of immigrants. Whenever there is a global crisis, whenever there are people who have faced serious challenges, as a country, Canada has always opened its doors for the people who have been victims of war, civil war, or other hardships as well. We saw this in the case of Syrian conflict. We saw this in the case of Afghan conflict. And currently, we are seeing this in the case of Ukrainian conflict. I was pleased to see that the government of Canada has not put any cap this time when it comes to Ukrainian refugees, and that Canada has opened its door to take as many as it can in the current environment. So you see that Canada, as a nation of immigrants and as a country that is committed to the diversity of people and values, sees immigration not simply as a tool of economic productivity, but also as a tool of, you can say, moral engagement as well. That if people are under, if people are facing extreme situations, war, civil wars, they can rely on our moral support and institutional support as well. So in that sense, immigration constitutes, immigration provides a normative, good when it comes to the framing of our common good in the Canadian context. Next slide, please. Now, when it comes to the Canadian society and the role of immigration, what we see is that Canada has sort of gone through three main phases in the past, say, 100 years or so. The first phase, which started in the early part of 20th century and continued maybe till mid 20th century, maybe even 60s, up to 60s, coming up to 60s, I guess, was a period that was marked by assimilation of immigrants in the Canadian society. The idea of assimilation connotes a society's desire to take new people and to make them in a certain way such that they can mirror the values, the ideas, the institutional composition that is at work. In other words, it is about providing the conditions that can encourage people to adopt the values, the culture of the host society. In the early part of 20th century and even coming up to mid 20th century, the bulk of immigrants who arrived to Canada came from European countries. That being so, there was a commonality of culture and values and engagement, and it was expected and desired that the new immigrants who came to Canada, they will assimilate. But next phase is marked by a philosophy of integration. This came into effect particularly after the heated debates on bilingualism and biculturalism in the 60s, when Canadians debated regarding the political makeup of the country, what kind of country we want to be. And it was sort of agreed that we are going to be a bilingual country, but multicultural country as well. So we are bilingual, but we are not bicultural. That was the debate in the 60s. Do we want to be bilingual and bicultural, or do we want to be bilingual and multicultural? Now, once we have introduced the idea of multiculturalism, the question is how different cultures are going to connect with the Canadian culture. Integration provides part of that answer. It requires new immigrants, or it hopes that the new immigrants will integrate in the Canadian society. So it's a little softer and milder than assimilation, but it still takes the values and the culture of the host society or the Canadian society as the benchmark, expecting that the new immigrants will adjust to that culture. In the political context, it seems to make more, you can say, sense, but it gets a little bit tricky when it is put in a cultural context. And I will come to that in a moment. Because multiculturalism, which has become the final phase and the dominant phase of our contemporary social discourse and Canadian immigration policy, insists that all cultures carry equal weight in the public domain, such that no culture should be privileged. In that sense, multiculturalism insists on the equality of all cultures. And contemporary Canadian society is a multicultural society. And so it emphasizes the cultural equality of all people and all cultures. And that is why we even notice sometimes that whenever a demand for integration is made, there is automatically assumed that there is somewhat a tension between the people who are making the demand and the rest of Canadians. And I think that's a bit of a fine line to walk, because we want to, of course, encourage integration, but we do not want to do that in a way such that it is perceived as a kind of cultural imposition of one people over other. Next slide, please. So what can we do? This brings us to the third axis, the third question. What can be done to fostering consensus on immigration? Well, I just said that when it comes to integration, there is, whenever there is a talk of integration, there is supposed to be a cultural tension, or sometimes it is perceived that way. And that, to me, is a sign that a lot of work needs to be done to ensure that the Canadian consensus on immigration stays intact, stays strong. One way to do that, I think, is to ensure that the economic marginalization that sometimes comes in picture when we look at the integration of immigrants in various sectors of life should be addressed adequately. Systemic barriers need to be removed, because when we are faced with marginalization or curtailed opportunity, or any kind of systemic barrier, we find ourselves at a very difficult spot, because we are working at cross purposes. And I said we are working at cross purposes because our goal is to promote integration and inclusion. But we cannot promote integration and inclusion if there are barriers, and if there are curtailed opportunities, or if there are cases of marginalization. So as a society and as a country, we have to remain watchful that we create institutions, we make policies that lead to the inclusion of everyone, all people, all Canadians, irrespective of their race, religion, and ethnicity, or the place of origin for that matter. So that is extremely important, something that we need to do, need to remain vigilant as a people. And this aspect is something that we cannot emphasize enough. The next aspect that comes to my mind and that I want to focus on is the question of identity and the common good. Because there is a growing, you can say, tendency among many Canadians to emphasize the aspect of one's identity. And sometimes the question of identity is posited against the common good as well. Because everyone has a cultural identity of their own, their preferences are going to be different, their priorities are going to be different. And to the extent their cultural priorities, their moral priorities are different, they are going to somehow cross over in the economic domain, political domain, and other kinds of policy making, making it difficult to forge a consensus on the common good. And this is something that needs to be navigated, and it is a hard question, I realize that. It is hard because, as has been argued by numerous political thinkers, including Apaya, is that dominant identities tend to control discourse, social discourse. And subordinate identities are just the victims of that discourse. So subordinate identities remain subordinate, and the dominant identities remain dominant. We need to find ways to break that dichotomy. Need to find ways to construct a common identity that is reflective of all Canadians, and that does not get bogged down in this oppositional formulation, where one identity is confronted by another one. Because in that commonality, we find surest guarantee when it comes to the success of Canadian multiculturalism. Next slide, please. We must do this because identity is never fixed. So the identity of my parents is not the same identity that I carry. And I'm sure if you look at your parents or your relatives or your surroundings, you will see that your identity is different than theirs. But identity movements or the politicization of identity is somehow based on a core identity. Something that is sort of moral absolute, sort of ethical absolute that is there forever. Identity is important, but identity formation is a constant negotiation between an individual and its cultural surrounding. In that sense, the notion of identity is very elastic. It has some firm center to it, but it also has a lot of latitude to be negotiated, to be challenged, to be discussed, to evolve. And in that sense, whenever someone serves a notion of identity that is very rigid and very absolute, you have to ask if they are factoring the possibility of self-evolution, self-development, self-progress in the construction of their conception of identity. I don't know about you, but when I look at myself, I tend to identify, at least in the past, I identified myself with certain values that I will probably not do that now. If you look at traditional societies, for instance, then most of the societies prioritize male child over girl child. So a boy over girl distinction, for instance. Now, if you look at the world, you still see that that there is a gender bias in many countries at many places against women. Do you want to believe that, or do you want to include that in the part of your identity construction? I don't think so. I don't want that either. So what you see is that I am saying this to establish a larger point that one's identity is continuously negotiated and continuously evolves. Because what you believe is a part of your identity. So if you believe in gender equality, then gender equality you can identify with. But if you believe in gender difference, then you can't identify with that. So that goes on to establish the point that identity is something that is negotiated and that can change over time. And I'm not denying here that there are some core elements, but I just do not want, at least I'm not comfortable with an idea of identity that is so static, so rigid, so hard that it cannot be negotiated, it cannot evolve. And I hope you are able to see my point here as well. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. So this brings us to the fourth axis of this presentation, which is the equity and inclusion and its role in the making of the common good, particularly in the Canadian society. Now, if you look at the OECD countries, then about 15% of jobs belong to the public sector. And these jobs are disproportionately taken by the locals. That is also a fact. Whereas in the low wage sector jobs, immigrants do bulk of the work. And this has made some thinkers wonder, including Castle and Davidson, that there are structural factors, there are cultural factors prevalent in the Western societies that tend to marginalize immigrants. And COVID-19 pandemic has brought them out to the front, where low-wage jobs, of course, are done by immigrants, and high-paying or well-paying jobs, secure jobs, so not an adequate representation of immigrants. Now, when you look at a reality, that's one aspect, and what is the cause is another aspect. So by looking at this formulation, you cannot derive the conclusion that immigrants are discriminated or that immigrants are stopped from entering in the public sector jobs. What you can do, though, is to reflect over what could be potential causes. Is it that maybe immigrants do not like to work in the public sector? Maybe they prefer more personal endeavor and enterprises and businesses. That could be one thing. Or next, that maybe there are not enough qualified candidates to fill those jobs. Maybe there is an educational gap between the when you look at immigrant population and when you look at the local population. There could be various factors, there could be various explanations, and I will encourage you to think them through prior to settling on a particular conclusion. But no matter what the causation is, the fact remains that 15% of jobs are available in the public sector, or close to 15%, and that immigrants are not well represented there. So we need to reflect over that and possibly think about various ways in which we can enhance that representation. Because in a democratic country in particular, institutions should be representative of the people. If people cannot see themselves belonging to those institutions, then the core idea behind democracy is somehow compromised. So descriptive representation may not be the ideal, but it's a sort of necessary for a democratic country to some extent. So I think that we can think about ways in which this can be done. But I will, again, as I said, submit to you to not jump on any conclusion per se. You need to think this through, and more research needs to be done on this. Next, please. Next slide, please. Okay. This brings me to finally, the conclusion as well as further reflections in this webinar. So if Canada wants to attract the best and brightest immigrants now and in future, I think Canada will have to compete in the global marketplace, because we see that our world is marked by various kinds of technological development and technocrats. And that we live in a sort of global village where different countries draw when it comes to labor and help and immigrants from different sources and different countries. And as a result, we have to provide the best, you can say, opportunities for people to to attract the best and the brightest. When we look at Canadian society and Canadian policy, for instance, many steps have been taken already to address this aspect. Canada has one of the most generous, citizenship opportunity laws. So for instance, someone who comes to Canada as a permanent resident, after some years, they are eligible to become citizens, which is excellent. Likewise, Canada emphasizes the intake of immigrants based on a point system, making sure that the immigrants who arrive in Canada are well qualified, well deserving. Now, the qualification of immigrants comes handy when it comes to their economic employment and economic productivity. So you see that Canada tries to attract the best and the brightest from the get-go. And that is why it is even more important for us to be competitive in terms of offering opportunities to the new immigrants. I think that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms does a great deal, provides the philosophical foundation and institutional framework that is needed to support Canadian immigration policy. What we need to do is to take the Charter seriously and find ways to translate it in our own lives and experiences, in the sense that the values that are laid out in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms become our values as Canadians, and not simply as a you can say legal document. That transition will go a long way in supporting Canadian multiculturalism, is strengthening Canadian multiculturalism. Next slide, please. So what are the direct challenges to the common good in the Canadian society, particularly in the context of immigration? I have listed some of them. I'm sure you are familiar with them. And I take this opportunity to invite you to reflect over them briefly. Systemic barriers, parallel societies, religious intolerance, and racism. All of us have encountered these challenges in some form, in one form or the other. And we should recognize these challenges that need to be addressed. While recognizing the challenges, we should also take a measured view and not conflate these challenges as well. In other words, we should take a measured view of how much systemic barriers we have, or what kind of parallel societies we have, what kind of religious intolerance and cases of racism. So by no means we are a perfect society. We are not a perfect society, and no one claims to be a perfect society. But what we want to recognize and what we want to reinforce is that We may be an imperfect society, but we want to march towards perfection bit by bit, little bit at a time. And that implies that whenever we confront the factors that are counterproductive, that are against our core philosophy of multiculturalism, be it any barrier, be it parallel society or religious intolerance or racism, we raise our hand and get counted against that. So we should make efforts to address the challenges that we see in our society, that we see in our institutions. And this is very important because this common effort, this common commitment to multiculturalism in Canada has led to a widespread consensus on the positive role of immigration in the Canadian society. So we want to strengthen that going forward, because whatever we do now has consequences and shows its result after 5 years, 6 years, 10 years. And if we want to create a culture of equality, respect, mutual accommodation, and common welfare, we need to be attentive of each other and each other's concerns. Bhikkhu Parikh has pointed this out, and I think it is pertinent to us at this point of time, that when it comes to belonging, when it comes to being the citizen of a country, when it comes to being a member of a society, when it comes to integration, it is always a two-way street, in the sense that the host society has to be willing to accept the immigrants, and the immigrants have to be willing to accept the principles, values that are prevalent and that are accepted by the host society as well. So we want to emphasize that mutuality. Next point, next slide, please. Well, that brings us to the end of this webinar. I have tried to address most questions that I think arise in the context of ethics, immigration, and the common good. But I look forward to taking the questions and hearing your thoughts as well. Once again, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Shukla. This has been a very fascinating webinar that you've provided to us. And we do have some questions in the question and answer box. So I'll just start right at the top. So there's an attendee who's very curious and would love to hear more about your current research and what you're finding. So can you tell us a little bit about your current research?
So I have been looking at the notion of identity formation of immigrants, as I mentioned. And what I see is that when it comes to identity, it is extremely important for the first generation immigrants, and sometimes even for the second generation immigrants. But identity is never fixed or static. And so when we look at how people view themselves and how host society or how locals view them, there is a sort of like a tussle, because integration would require, for instance, a little bit more lucid notion of identity, where people can identify with each other's values, for instance. That does not always happen, and that leads to what I think is an intensification of identity in the public sphere, and that causes its own problems. To me, it seems that we need to uh, open up a little bit and look at this question in a more holistic way, such that every individual's identity is respected and preserved and treated in an inviolable, sacred manner. But at the same time, it also remains open to some sort of negotiation that we do all the time. And my hope is that the more openness we have, the better chances are that we are going to connect with our fellow citizens and that we are going to construct a more robust notion of the common good.
Very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Dr. Shukla. And the next question for you is there an ethical framework that you defer to when faced with ethical dilemmas?
Well, that would depend on what the dilemma is, because ethical dilemmas come in different forms. Some of them can be resolved, some of them are hard to resolve. And the goal for me is to respond to the dilemma that is there in possibly the most human and humane way, such that we do not become a sort of hostage of our own principles, but keep our intellectual and emotional prudence intact while tackling the dilemmas that are served. So it will, depend on the situation, it will depend on the time, and it will depend on the question that is at hand. But I do say, and I do think that in every situation, if there is not a better option, then there is definitely at least an option which is a less bad than the other option. And so you always try to make effort to minimize the harm and maximize the good. So yeah, it's going to be very contextual, and it will depend on the question.
Absolutely, thank you. And the next question is asking you to speak a little bit to the way that Canada approaches immigration and integration versus the way that the United States or the Europe approach immigration or integration.
So I think that Canada is closer to the US than Europe, because both Canada and US are perceived as the settler societies, whereas Europe is viewed as a more like a historical society. The difference between the settler society and the historical is that the Canadians, basically the European Canadians, they came to Canada and they settled in Canada and in the US, whereas Europeans have always been in Europe. They have gone elsewhere, but Europe is their homeland in that sense. So in that sense, Canada is closer to the US. Now, US still views itself as the melting pot. US is still views in the US still looks at immigration in the sense of assimilation. In other words, when somebody goes to US and lives in the US, they are expected to identify themselves as Americans, and that the political and constitutional values that are there, they are there for everybody. Canadian society and Canadian system is multicultural, so it gives you more room to navigate. It recognizes the cultural identity of immigrants, and it does not require them to assimilate. The maximum that we see in Canadian context is the call for integration. Now, the call for integration can differ from province to province. Somewhere it is stronger than elsewhere. But assimilation is not the leading trend in the Canadian society, whereas it still continues to play a dominant role in the US. So in that sense, Canada differs from US. And if you look at Europe, then of course in Europe, the demand for assimilation is probably much higher than in the US and Canada. So that, and there are historical reasons for that as well. So yeah, I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for comparing and providing some similarities and differences there in a really concise way. And the next question is around the current crisis in the Ukraine. And so the attendee is mentioning that the crisis in Ukraine is definitely very worrisome. And some Canadians are worried about that the government didn't put a cap on the number of Ukrainian refugees and are creating special pathways for this group to come to Canada. Do you see this as a concern, Dr. Shukla?
No, I do not see that as a concern, because remember that you may say that the policy in the case of Ukraine is reflective of the challenge that we are facing at this point of time. And Canadian government has tried to respond accordingly. So I think that it is excellent that they have not put a cap and that they are trying to provide a safe haven to as many Ukrainian refugees as they can. And I will hope that they continue to adopt a policy that is attentive to the situation, as in this case. So I think that this is a timely response to a crisis that is unfolding in front of our eyes, and I do not see any difficulty with the response. I think I support it, and I hope that they adopt similar policies whenever they are faced with similar challenges.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Shukla. We're coming to the end of our time together today, but we will be moving the webinar recording as well as any lingering questions in the question and answer box into N4's meeting place. And Dr. Shukla is a member of N4 and will be answering your questions in the discussion forum. And I did want to thank all of those who joined today for engaging in our question and answer period, as well as providing comments and questions. And if you missed any part of today's presentation or would like to watch the session again, there will be a recording on the N4 platform within the next week, and we will address any unanswered questions in the meeting place. We've also curated several resources related to today's webinar topic from Dr. Shukla, as well as some of our network partners. And you can find these in our resource toolkit, and we will link them when we share the on-demand version of this webinar. If you haven't yet, please sign up to newcomernavigation.ca for all of our resources and learning opportunities. As well, following today's session, there will be a survey that will pop up in your browser, and we kindly ask that you do complete this brief survey. Thank you again, Dr. Shukla. We have about 30 seconds remaining. Is there any final remarks from you to the audience?
I just want to thank everyone for taking time to attend to this webinar and also for the questions as well. It has been a pleasure to engage with you this afternoon, and I thank you very much and all the best.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Dr. Shukla. It was a pleasure to have you join us today, and thanks to everyone else for joining. We hope to see you at a future event.
Thank you.